Hi people. Today we are going to be talking about the basics of pawn endgames. Pawn endgames, they are very common since they can come from all sorts of positions. Our main goal for pawn endgames is to promote to a queen. The first thing we should talk about is the square. The enemy king can stop our pawn if they are in or can move into the square. So how do we find the square? One of the corners is the square that our pawn is on, the second corner is the promotion square, the third is diagonal from our pawn, and the last one should be easy to find. The pawn can promote without the help of the king if our enemy's king isn't in or can't get into the square. Here if it's black to move, you can see that it walked into the square and you can see that it stops the pawn before promotion. If it was white to move instead, then black won't be able to catch up and we would get a new queen. Now if our pawn were to be on its beginning square, you would need to take into account our pawn's long move. Something else you need to know for pawn endgames is opposition. Opposition is when the two kings face each other with only a one square distance, so they're pretty much as close as possible. Opposition is important for when we're fighting for space. We can use it to get into enemy territory or to prevent our enemy king from breaking into our territory. Now let's look at this position with opposition present and a pawn. Now here it matters on who moves first. You don't want to give up the opposition, it's usually bad. Here if it was white to move, then it would be giving up opposition and black would just keep following around our king and we make no further progress because we can't go forward. We never want to be the one giving up the opposition. But if it was black that needed to move, we can just advance our king one square diagonally to the left because we can't move to the right diagonally because of their king. Once we move forward, we secure more space for our pawn, these squares right here. If black retreats and is aligned with our pawn like so, we take up opposition, and when black gives up opposition we advance again diagonally, securing more space, and we have secured a road for our pawn to promote, and black won't be able to stop it. Now if they were to go back this way and not be aligned with our pawn, that's fine, we can move up our king a bit to secure more space. We get into opposition when the enemy's king is aligned with our pawn. We can even push our pawn here instead of going up. Now let's go back to the position where white had to move. Now we can see that the king is being followed by the other king. White pushes their pawn. Now, our pawn should never be side by side with our king or be in front of our king. Like never, it should be behind the king builds the road there, and with the pawn in front or next to the king, there won't be any road. So black now faces the pawn and white advances the pawn because they can't get into opposition. Now if you were to be the one defending, you want to be in front of the pawn. The general rule is to take up opposition if you can and stay in front of the pawn if you can't take up opposition. So you see black just going back, staying in front of the pawn. The white king marches up, so black takes up opposition and white can either go back to the square it was once at, hide behind the pawn, or push their pawn. All of them lead to a draw. If they go back to the same square, you just go back in front of the pawn. There has to be a one square distance in between the kings, and you're trying to take up opposition here because if there are two, then they can just go up and now you're the one giving up opposition. The second option, if they hide behind the pawn, we go in front of the pawn. If they come out, we come out with them if there is a one square distance. And finally, if they push their pawn and give us a check, we just go in front of the pawn. It's going to be a draw whether they move behind it or away from it. Okay, so all those examples were with the pawn pretty close to the promotion square already, so how do we get our pawn there from the start? Well, it's about the same thing as from the examples before, just much longer. If their king is aligned with our pawn, we take up opposition, advance our king diagonally forward once they give up opposition, and slowly move up our pawn from there. If the enemy king just goes straight back, we go up 2 to secure more space, and if they do this, standing next to our king like so, yeah, that doesn't work. We can just advance our pawn. Just make sure that the pawn is never in front or side by side with our king, and if the enemy king is ever aligned with our pawn, we take up opposition. Just remember to not give up opposition and don't be aligned with the pawn unless the enemy king is. If the enemy king were to be very far away like over here, it would be an easy win because you can just use your king to wall the area off if it gets too close. Sometimes if both kings are racing towards the pawn, we can waste a move to make sure we get the opposition, like so. Now all of that should be easy to follow. For the b through g pawns, rook pawns are different. The rook pawns are the a and h pawns. It's somewhat more difficult to promote them, but still possible. For rook pawns, our king needs to occupy one of these 2 squares. Same thing if it was on the other side. But if the enemy king were to be in one of these squares, we won't be able to promote it. And the same thing if the rook pawn was on the other side. Here's an example of the enemy king getting to the squares. You can see that white takes control of the promotion square, but the enemy king was able to get to the squares it needs to. Now the white king is just stuck. And it's just a stalemate. Now if white did get out and move here, it's still a stalemate. We have to make sure our king gets to those squares first. If black is able to get to any of the squares, then there is no hope for a pawn promotion. Now here our king made it and the black king can't get to the pawn. We provided a road for our pawn to promote. Now we can create rook pawns for our opponents for a greater chance of getting a draw, like this position. Black created a rook pawn and then immediately ran to one of the squares to prevent promotion. But we can't always win like this. Sometimes we can't make it in time. But creating a rook pawn is still a good way to try and secure a draw. It doesn't automatically give us a draw, but our chances are much higher. Just remember which squares you need to get to. We have to hope there's a misstep from our opponent, which will probably happen. Endgames are hard. So yeah. Pawn endgames, kind of difficult, but with enough practice you should be fine. But other than that, please subscribe and bye people.